say, Jack,
Yeah,
you know,
I had a joint honours in science. I was the head of science, and so the last speaker, that sense of science was right at the heart of how I began to teach. But one of my first dragons I had to overcome was the epistemology of science, because I found that the very methods that I used as a research scientist were totally inapplicable when it came to explaining my educational influence in my own learning and the learning of my students, literally with values of human flourishing. I could use the scientific methods of controlled experimental designs. My master's degree in psychology used that when I came to try to explain my own professional learning and my educational influence on my students. I had to actually overcome that dragon of my background in science, okay? And it isn't that I don't value science, I hope I'm being understood here. It's that the methods were totally inappropriate for my work as an educational practitioner and researcher. Okay, so that's one of the first dragons of trying to overcome the epistemology of the scientist that was applied to my educational research. Now the second dragon was one that I met in the academy in terms of my question, which I started my very first day's teaching. I was a disaster. It was in the East End of London. And I realised in my very first lesson I was not communicating to my students, okay? I had a background in science. I went there with O-level science. My students clearly did not understand. I left that day, the first day, asking my question, how can I improve? I am not communicating. What must I do to actually communicate scientific understanding to my students? Now, in the university, where in the second year I started to study for my academic diploma in philosophy and psychology, another 2 years on the part-time, masters in psychology, the I within my question, how do I improve my practice, was explicitly eliminated by the university academics. So it had been in science, I was taught in science and science, I've got to eliminate the I as merely subjective and anecdotal. When I started to research my practice with my question, how do I improve what I'm doing with values of human flourishing, my university academics were all telling me I've got to take the I out. Not only those, but when I started to supervise doctorates, the ethics committees and the research committees were all asking for the I to be removed. Am I making sense here? Because this is the second dragon I had to overcome. And Michael Polanyi, the philosopher, helped me to do that in his book Personal Knowledge, because he said, look, my purpose is not to create a theory, it's much more ambitious than that. I've got to strip away the crippling mutilations of centuries of objectivist thought. Now, that led me to insist that the I actually is included within the epistemology, within the explanation of educational influence. Am I making sense here? Mm-hmm. That's the second dragon. The third dragon, again, university-based. At the University of Bath, the regulations until 2000 said you can't submit e-media in research degrees. Now, a lot of my work required digital visual data. I couldn't actually get at an understanding of values without that kind of data. So I had to work to change the university regulations to allow the submission of e-media. Now that was the third dragon. And some of you may have actually experienced these dragons, which for me were based on my professional life at the university. The fourth dragon, to a certain extent, was not. And this was my failing to take on what you were saying earlier about the internationalization. My question, how do I improve my practice? For many years, until about 2000, was focused on myself as an individual autonomous learner. But actually I started to engage in quite a lot of global professional development. I ran workshops in Nepal, in Australia, in Canada. Yeah? The one in South Africa actually stimulated me because I developed an understanding of Nelson Mandela's, or his notion of Ubuntu. Now that idea was I am because we are. That required me overcoming the dragon of my own individual autonomy. I had to develop a relational understanding of what it is to live communally and cooperatively within a social context. And to help me do that, I learnt a lot from Gregory Bateson's Steps Towards an Ecology of Mind. So it's that idea that you and I are related, literally, the trees giving off the oxygen, you know, they're taking in the carbon dioxide, the nature of those relationships when you're talking about the environment, absolutely vital. Now that Steps Towards an Ecology of Mind, linked to Skolimowski's a participatory research program, helped me to overcome the dragon of that individual autonomous I. I began to relate in a perspective that said, even now, as we're here together, that I hope you sense that I'm engaged with you. You know, so I'm going to stop literally in 2 or 3 minutes to ask what you think about those dragons, because they seem to me to be absolutely crucial, you know, to overcome those. And I'm still working on it, that one of the relational dynamic. And I'll show you where you can actually access the actual details, not only of this presentation here, because if you go into my webpage, which is Action Research, the actionresearch.net, that, I don't quite understand why that's there.
Yeah. You just need to done.
Done, just press done. Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah, there we go. Now, what I hope you'll do is go into actionresearch.net. It's got literally, when I started teaching in 1967, my first publications were in the first journal of this organisation, which was called the British Journal of In-Service Education. My first 3 papers were published in there, and they were all about my classroom practice and research into those. And I actually focused on the development of knowledge, and they're all in the Jack Whitehead's writings section here. Literally, you know, it goes up from that first to the last one, which came out this last week, which is in the Journal of Professional Praxis. It's actually developed in Nepal, but I hope you'll get into that because it just shows you the whole total development from starting classroom teacher, how do I improve my science understanding of my pupils, right up to the present day, where I'm fascinated by that sense of the internationalization. How do I work with a group of, for example, mainly Muslim women in Indonesia for this 4th World Congress on transformative educational research and sustainable development, when I know that my humanistic perspective, as a humanist, a member of the British Humanist Association, I'm very aware that my spiritual values are quite different from the cultural expectations of working. For example, when I was working with Swarup Rawal in India, Swarup was very influenced by Hinduism. Am I making sense here? That actually coming to dialogue and genuinely embracing, and with that sense of inclusivity, and the actual sense of joint empowerment is very important. So I'm actually going to say, look, please access this website. You've got access to our latest book that I've just done with Marie on living educational theory research, epistemology for practice. Okay, now the living educational theory is where each one of us, I believe, along with Marie, has a capacity to produce an evidence-based, which is valid, values-laden explanation of our educational influences, not only in our own learning, but in the learning of others. So this is why you're entitled to ask me, where's the evidence that I've had an educational influence in anybody else's learning? I was not very popular in America when I started to ask the key people, actually, to develop those ideas of pedagogical content knowledge. I asked them the question, well, I understand what you're saying, it's clear, but do you have any evidence that anything you've done has had an educational influence in the learning of anybody? Okay, now, that question really continues to fascinate me, but it actually threw those academics. They could not answer that question. They did not have the evidence that any of them had used their own ideas to explain their educational influence in their own learning and the learning of others. And although I like those ideas of the pedagogical content knowledge, and in particular the pedagogical one, I keep asking that question of myself. What evidence do I have that I had this educational influence? It's now gone from my classroom into these global contexts. But I want to pause because I want to give you that opportunity to actually just respond in any way, because I've outlined what I would call these dragons that I've faced, you know, in the course of those 50-odd years of sustained professional learning and development. Did any of them resonate with you? I mean, because I know, Claire, where you're actually doing the second year of your professional doctorate. You know, again, it will be really important in a professional doctorate, I think, to demonstrate your educational influence, not only in your own learning, but the learning of others. And that, to me, is what makes you a professional doctor, you know, to actually have those influences. So I'll pause there and just ask, have you had any responses, you know, to those 4 dragons? But I do hope you'll access this. What's new, you'll be able to get into there. You can access the keynote that I just gave to the conference here, this one on transformative living educational theory research. I think that conference is fantastic. It's first 3 organised from Nepal, the 4th one last month from Indonesia, and the proceedings from the 3rd are really superb. So I'm going to pause there. Any responses to those dragons and your own experience? Yes, please.
Well, I could relate to everything you said, really. Well, you know, for all the dragons, I think, are, you know, we have experienced. But I think that sometimes, when I hear about different aspects of professional learning, I sometimes feel that by focusing too much on the professional learning experience in its own, you know, the particular event, sometimes we might undermine the significance of context, what you said about context and the relational context. So earlier when you were doing the presentation about global learning, global training opportunities, really, there is always an elephant in the room. And we cannot, if we dismiss the elephant and we hyper-focus on the incident, we are underestimating the challenges.
Absolutely.
So, the positioning of me and myself and my experience and how I deal with all this is very significant because it gives another dimension. It is not liked by many academic departments, and especially the more sciencey related. So, for example, we do participatory action research, and we're very passionate about it. We were presenting our work, and there was somebody, you were not there, but there was somebody from psychology that came to me almost in tears afterwards, and she said, they don't let me do it. I'm doing a PhD in psychology, and they say, you know, action research is not good enough. It's too idiosyncratic. It's not sciencey. It's not so. There is still this, you know, we have to fight all these battles to establish this as a valid, insightful, useful way of knowing, and actually, I see this as privileged against other approaches because it actually shows what is education for, whom is it for, and for what purposes.
So your name is?
Mariana.
Mariana. And where are you working, Mariana?
University, Christchurch, Canterbury.
Oh, right. No.
But that experience comes from other, you know, in the past there was in other institutions. That's not, I don't think this is specific to Christchurch, but...
No. Oh no,
there is an academic discourse there that we have to push against.
Oh yes, no, it would be lovely to keep that connection, you know, so I do hope you'll perhaps give Marie your email after this session so we can...
And I have cited you in the past, when I was doing action research, yes. There is a connection there, for me at least.
But it's that, you see, just, I don't know if you sense it, but just at that moment then, okay, there was a burst of energy. I don't know if you all felt that, but that was a delight, all right? So the pleasure that I was then feeling, and it was embodied. That is part of that life-affirming energy, which through the digital visual data, you can bring into your explanation. So when you talked earlier about your enthusiasm for what you're doing in the MD, it's that, not to miss that from the representation. So you had a question.
Yeah, we were chatting last year as well, so I'm in work-based learning, and I coach apprentices who are basically doing a qualification in their workplace, and I think like the sort of, a lot of that sort of thinking where, for example, I very much always encourage them to really see themselves and accept that they have that learner identity, but also that workplace identity, and to give them the tools to enable them to really think for themselves and find their own path. And I think it's something, you know, I have been, on reflection, privileged sort of to have had that opportunity to flourish, to find what do I want to do and why am I doing it. And now I'm able to almost hold that mirror for myself, but also giving that mirror to the others, for them to feel comfortable, to be like, okay, yeah, my context is different, but my context is just as valid, and I can actually add with what I'm doing to, you know, with my perspective. And it's really about that enabling and that empowering, I think, in a sense, people to trust that their perspective on the world is valid.
And also, very important but also to embrace the idea of empowerment as an explanatory principle. So the work with the Indonesian group, a lot of the work with the women is focused on empowerment, because they recognise they live in a patriarchal society where a lot of them are actually disadvantaged. Now, I think you mentioned earlier the economic, you know, now I'm incredibly privileged. I've just published a paper in a book which examines my excessive privilege, okay, economically. For example, you know, many people that I work with in the context, they have got problems economically. I don't. You know, I've left my work with a full pension. I don't have to bother now until I die. Now, that releases me enormously. In South Africa, the Zulu women, they needed to earn money. And one of the researchers at Durban University, Bernie Kaplan, her master's is actually on developing economic independence in Zulu women, you know, because that was a priority. So both of you, and what you're saying there, absolutely vital, and especially that notion of the vocation. I love what Annie said about, you know, establishing the notion of vocation. It is a calling, you know, it's really crucial. Is there anything else that you're feeling you would take out?
Can I suggest, Jack, that you say you're not allowed to do this? It might help you to be able to point people that you're talking with to examples where people have done this. It's been legitimated in various universities around the world, because sometimes it helps when you're dealing with people's dragons, their own fears, is to say, actually this can be done. It's already been done, so you can actually travel together. So on the doctoral thesis, there's a couple of my psychologists, including Barry Heimer, who's now an emeritus professor at Cumbria University. Sometimes that helps. And seeing your knowledge actually out there and people engaging with it. Again, it's actually saying, taking that responsibility, accepting that challenge.
I think it's also like sort of, it challenges you to get away from that silo thinking of, like, I'm seeing a lot, because of course, you know, my background is industry. I work in hospitality and I work with data analysts, I work with digital product managers, and I'm seeing so many of those industry approaches. For example, like, you know, when we think of like how, you know, a product has a life cycle and you've got to go through, you know, discovery first, is it actually valid? And so many of those transferable sort of ideas should be almost brought into educational thinking a lot more, to see it as a product. But, you know, if you're not being given that confidence to go for it, and be like, okay, actually, let me see where that path is going to take me. It might be a dead end, but you are still going to learn something, because there will be another turn off before you get to the real dead end that's going to take you somewhere where you don't know where you're going. And I think it's about having that confidence to let your thoughts and to let those things that you are picking up along the way lead you wherever it's going to take you, because you don't know where it's going to take you.
Yeah, go on.
Can I add a final thought that relates to that? I think it all comes down to power. Power is everywhere. So it is not ignorance that stops people from accepting certain paradigms. I think it is power. It is about exercising power and control. So it is imbued in all these structures. So for me, for us, participatory action research is a way of addressing this. It's a way of empowering certain groups or individuals to push against this, which is what you're saying.
I don't know if you have been informed by the work of Michel Foucault on power, but if you get into Michel Foucault's work, what he talks about, the universal intellectual. Now, listening to Annie with the keynote, but most of the academics speak as if they are what are called universal intellectuals. Okay, now that was Foucault, and his critique was, he was saying, no, we should actually locate our research in the context of our workplace, where we are situated by our research. And that notion of power is so important. You know, power, knowledge, the relationships of our vested interests. So bear that in mind. The empowerment is a value that I think is really important. Now, could I just finish it by just pointing to this? That this idea of internationalization, and if you like, being a global educator, so now nearing the end of my life as well as professional learning, it's become increasingly focused on this idea of global education, you know, the internationalization. And the excitement that I get, this is an idea Marie Huxtable put forward here, about living posters. So if you go in here, you could actually, if you wish, help to create the IPDA kind of living posters. You know, everybody here, some whose name I don't know, you know, now it could be possible for you to put your living poster and submit it so that we could actually add it to this global network of living posters. Now, these here, in the Nelson Mandela Group, the Indonesian Transformative Education Research Group, really exciting. Durban University of Technology and the Education for Development Sustainability. Now, these are all different groups that are developing their living educational theories. They're all willing to take the eye, to recognise the fundamental importance of the values base we hold, and each one of us has got a unique constellation of values that we can use as explanatory principles. So if you would, do get into that. It's the living posters, and it's in the What's New section near the top of the Action Research, .net. So on the right there, you've got the living, so at the top, Living Theory Posters homepage, which, as I say, gets you into an enormous range. This one here for the Educational Journal of Living Theories, that is our journal where we actually consider for publication from all over the world these kind of accounts. But it just would enable us to get some kind of connection which doesn't just finish literally in 5 minutes. It would enable us, for example, that point about your, it was so exciting to meet you today, to learn about your professional doctorate that you're in your second year. You know, because unlike me, you have many years left of professional learning and development to share with others and generate the knowledge. Now, by actually making sure that your context and the living posters appear within a group that we could have for IPDA, would enable us to sustain those conversations. And then that point there, you know, sense of the empowerment, really crucial.
And
yes,
a tool, sorry Marie, a tool to defeat the epistemological dragon, as I am forevermore going to refer to it as, which is ever with us, and actually in all of our presentations today, that epistemological dragon, we need to be the people who have the positioning to combat that idea. It's in David's work, it's in your work, Jay, as well as in Jack's presentation here, because I know a lot of you are living that, and I know a lot of my students on doctorates of various kinds are living with that. But the thing is, they are infused, some of them, Jack, with the positivist background of a science person, and they have such an internal struggle when they come to an educational context, and that's exactly what your teachers have been. You were describing with your teachers, David.
Yeah, that was
very interesting.
That was my very first dragon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go on.
One last thing. Can I urge people to actually have a look at Jack's site? Because you're saying about the economics of people being able to access higher education. I'm not saying about training, I'm talking about education. What is it to learn to live a satisfying, productive and worthwhile life and help others learn to do so too? If that's at the base of education. And what Jack's shown us is how we can actually contribute to democratisation of, because people from all over the world can access this. The kids in that ADS group, some of them can't even afford it to eat an egg every day, but they've got a phone. They can access this. They can actually put on what it is that they are actually learning that helps them to feel recognised and valued and using the simplest of technologies. And you can start your own website for free. So
exactly.
walk in our own
It's
talk.
something we need to strive for.
I very much follow Jack's example.
Accessibility of education.
And if you
But we are
challenge,
education.
if you are challenged or questions about the academic credibility of this form of research, okay? If you go onto this section, living theory theses, now there are over 50 living theory doctorates that have been legitimated by different universities around the world. So you can easily go into that. This is the latest from the UK. This was last month. Doctoral thesis, Living Educational Theory Research to Continuing Professional Development in Education, University of Cumbria. You know, and it is that living theory explanation. It is a person that studied her own professional learning over years, had the influence with the children and with others, and also the influence on the social formation. So don't hesitate, just point, you know, when you can't miss it. You know, this one, Privileged Tacit Knowledge. Ariana Brigantes, that one. Doctoral thesis, My Living Theory of International Development. John Branches, again, Professional Studies on Public Works. But each one of those, and 50 of them, as I say, has got, in different universities, their award. You know, I was so pleased last year. This time last year, University of Worcester awarded me a D.Lit degree, you know, it's a Doctor of Letters, for the work that I've done on professional learning and development, you know, the research on that. And it's really lovely to have that kind of recognition. So please do, just connect with us and communicate. Because as you've been, you know, it was exciting what you were saying, and it was lovely just to keep that connection. Are we okay for today? Am I done?
It's lunchtime, Jack.
Okay.
So what can I say?
Thank you.
Everyone.
That's really good. Thank you.